Welcome to CARICOM Matters. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. As you are aware, between September 1st and 3rd, our island of Barbados hosted the inaugural Afro-Caribbean Trade and Investment Forum. This week, we begin with Ambassador Commissiong's expressions of pleasure and delight as it relates to the success of that conference.
Well, it left me with a feeling of intense pride, a feeling of satisfaction that these kinds of initiatives are finally coming to fruition, and a feeling of great excitement and anticipation at what is to come. As you would know, this Trade and Investment Forum is one of the fruits of the first Africa CARICOM Heads of Government Summit that was held on the 7th of September last year. And that was a historic event. And within weeks of that event, a team from the African Export-Import Bank came to Barbados, held discussions with us here in Barbados, and we came to agreements in principle that we were going to do things like this. And it was so pleasing to see how committed that African institution was to the idea of building a trade and economic relationship between the Caribbean and Africa, and the idea of concretizing that by holding this summit. And they were clear. The summit was to be held in 2022. We were not to lose the momentum of the Heads of Government Summit of September 2021. So we were not going to postpone this thing into 2023 or 2024. We were going to work with the momentum that had been established. And so they had willing partners in Barbados, particularly Invest Barbados and Export Barbados, Prime Minister's Office. And it was a spectacular success. I mean, as a Barbadian, I was so proud because this was executed with the highest levels of professionalism. There were some 1,200 delegates at the forum, hailing from 41 different African countries, 16 Caribbean countries, and 25 non-African or non-Caribbean countries. What they saw and experienced was Barbados showing off its capability to hold a high-quality international event.
Ambassador Commissiong continues to speak of the conference's success and the type of future that lies ahead for both regions.
The president of the African Export-Import Bank, Professor Benedict Oramah, he didn't really have to sell me because I was already sold actually before the forum. What really impressed me was the determination of Professor Oramah and his team, because I was working with them behind the scenes in the months leading up to the conference, and I was impressed with their determination to make this relationship work. It wasn't any ifs or buts. So when he gave his opening address at the conference, the first morning of the conference, he reconfirmed everything I had been experiencing with officials from the bank in the months leading up to the event. So he spoke to the Caribbean as kith and kin. And he laid out his case that we are to come together. We are family. We are to come together. In fact, he had the audience laughing when he recommended that that some of the delegates should actually look for Caribbean marital partners, you know.
And to create institutional arrangements that will enable capacity building and greater daily engagements amongst ourselves, including more Africa-Caribbean marriages, so that the links we are rebuilding will be unbreakable.
And then, of course, Prime Minister Mottley, in her usual, very powerful, very insightful address, making the point about the challenges, these very serious challenges that face both Africa and the Caribbean, and that the only way we are going to deal with and overcome those challenges is by coming together and working together. So yes, it was almost a perfect event, to tell the truth. I mean, you would find it hard to find any aspect of that 4-day event, because although you said 1st to the 3rd, but I think we should factor in the opening reception at the Barbados Museum on the 31st, which set the tone in a brilliant way, introducing our continental African guests to Barbados and Barbadian culture and heritage and our entertainers and so forth. So every aspect of this event was first class, and I can tell you, because I've been in contact with many of our African guests since the conclusion of the forum, they're still raving about it. It has left a lasting impression on their minds, and it has laid a wonderful platform for this relationship. As you know, there's a commitment to hold a follow-up forum on the continent of Africa next year. In fact, in all likelihood, this is going to be an annual event, 1 year in the Caribbean, the following year in Africa. And some people are even calling for it to be a twice-a-year event. You know, that every year we should have not one forum, but 2 forums, one in each region. And so that is very encouraging, that it has evoked that kind of enthusiasm and spirit.
As for the CARICOM Secretariat, what role did it play in this conference? And what about future cooperation?
CARICOM was actually one of the sponsors of the Trade and Investment Forum. And at the opening ceremony, we would have heard addresses from the Secretary General of CARICOM, Dr. Carla Barnett, and also from the current chair of CARICOM, President Santokhi of Suriname. The CDB was also one of the co-sponsors of the forum. So I think it's fair to say that CARICOM is on board.
Well, of course, our Secretary General and the Chairman of the Conference of Heads of Government spoke in the opening ceremony and delivered very clear messages on the importance the region attaches to its trade and economic engagement with Africa, recognizing that the links between our 2 regions are deep and strong. So I think the Secretariat, which of course serves the community, would have engaged in the forum in support of the mission and the priorities that had been set, certainly by the Summit of African and CARICOM leaders, which indicated that trade and other areas of cooperation would be a priority, and recognizing that this forum would build upon that commitment of the summit. The Secretariat would have given it all the support that it could, recognizing that, of course, Barbados did a lot of heavy lifting in hosting and facilitating the conference, but in a manner that would have supported the full involvement of partners from Africa and regional partners throughout the Caribbean. At the broader level, of course, and arising out of the Summit of African and CARICOM leaders, and a memorandum of understanding to frame the cooperation between the CARICOM Secretariat and the African Union Commission has been developed and is in discussion between the 2 secretariats. Indeed, at the forum, Commissioner Muchanga declared his commitment to work expeditiously with the African Union Commission team to bring the memorandum to completion as quickly as possible. So I know our Secretary General underlined the importance of concluding this and the Commissioner's commitment suggests that we are on the path to finalizing this arrangement that would present a structure that brings the institutions of the two regions closer together in a working relationship. In addition, you might have noticed that in a presentation before the panel dealing with the imagining of a free trade agreement between Africa and the Caribbean, Commissioner Muchanga indicated that they would immediately commission studies on trade and investment prospects between Africa and the Caribbean. So at the level of his commission, we know that work is to be undertaken to build on some of what was discussed at the forum.
What about other framework for cooperation? Where are we with these? What is being done to facilitate trade and business between the two regions?
Institutionally, a framework for cooperation is well advanced. And practically, some of the elements that need to be assessed in terms of looking at practical ways forward in trade and economic cooperation are already being pursued, certainly on the Africa Union side, based on the commitment given by Commissioner Muchanga. On our side, the CARICOM Secretariat, certainly in its external trade team, looks constantly at the prospects presented for trade engagement across the world. And engagement with Africa would have been one of those important subjects for consideration and assessment. And with these developments, we certainly would be doing no less than the African Union has promised, which is to look at the multidimensional aspects of the trade prospects between our two regions.
How does Ambassador McCook view the engagement between Africa and the Caribbean?
The engagement between Africa and the Caribbean is one that the success of any such engagement is something that everyone would root for, not the least of which is linked to the deep connections between our regions. So I think the momentum for success for a forum such as this would have been positive from the get-go, from the outset. The fact that the Afreximbank has a history of doing these fora and investment activities in Africa reflected itself, I think, in the way it mobilized the participation of significant actors from the African side in the conference. So it meant that an opportunity was presented to the Caribbean side to engage at several levels with important players in the African trade and economic space. So to that extent, I think the matching of partners from both sides would have been positive for Africa and for the Caribbean. So I think that the assessments that this was a forum that brought great value to the regions and to CARICOM in particular is a valid assessment.
Ambassador Commissiong holds a similar view, and he thinks that the way forward is bright.
So many positive initiatives have come out of this first Trade and Investment Forum that I think the path ahead is extremely clear. First of all, many of the companies that came to the summit engaged with each other, and deals were signed. So that is one positive benefit. You actually have commercial enterprises from the Caribbean and Africa already beginning to sign commercial agreements. Then there was the signing of the partnership agreement between CARICOM nations and the African Export-Import Bank. We saw 7 CARICOM nations signing the partnership agreement at the summit, and there was a commitment from 2 others to sign. The others I know, for example, in the case of Jamaica, they told me that the matter is before their cabinet. So once the cabinet gives the green light, they will sign. So I would imagine that eventually all of the CARICOM member states will sign the partnership agreement.
For some time now, there has been some speculation and discussion regarding the possibility of having more direct links to the Caribbean from Africa. Did this conference move us closer to realizing that goal?
Coming out of the summit as well, there is now the momentum towards the establishment of a regular direct flight between Africa and the Caribbean. In fact, the Africa Export-Import Bank gave us a very positive example of what is possible with a direct flight between Africa and the Caribbean. They organized a charter, Ethiopian Airlines. It originated in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. It flew across the continent to Lagos, Nigeria, and then onwards to Barbados. So I think that positive example and the momentum generated by the forum is going to lead to the establishment of a direct flight between Africa and the Caribbean within a matter of months.
What are the prospects for trade between Africa and the Caribbean, and how will this be financed?
There's also the fact that the bank announced at the forum that it will be allocating $700 million to a facility to finance trade and investment between Africa and the Caribbean. In fact, there's also an agreement that we are going to establish in the Caribbean a Caribbean Export-Import Bank that will facilitate finance, trade, and investment between Africa and the Caribbean. And Barbados has perhaps taken it to the ultimate step where Barbados is actually applying to become a member of the Africa Export-Import Bank. So when we look at all of these positive outcomes of the Trade and Investment Forum, you know, I am very convinced that a solid platform has been laid, a solid program to take us forward has been sketched out. It is now simply for us to make sure that we follow through and concretize all these initiatives.
We certainly hope that the private sector takes full advantage of the financing that could redound the benefit of all of us in this partnership.
Everything is actually moving in the right direction. The Caribbean Private Sector Organization, which is an associate institution of CARICOM, that is a private sector body that brings together private sector business leaders across the Caribbean. They have joined forces with the African Business Council and the African Export-Import Bank to establish an African Caribbean Business Council. So we can see that an institutional framework is being put in place.
Ambassador McCook speaks of the role of the Caribbean private sectors in this partnership.
More, not less, is what we want. More engagement, more partnerships. And of course, the CPSO is an institution linked into CARICOM in a very specific way. And part of the engagement between the CPSO and the community is to bring the voice of key economic actors to the center of the discussions, particularly in relation to trade and economic policy in the region. An engagement of this sort between the CPSO and their counterpart on the continent would be a most valuable development for the relationship between the two regions, because the firms need to connect with each other. And the voices of the firms can only augment that connection, because institutionally they can bring a collective message to bear from one side to the other. So certainly one would hope that the CPSO would be able to bring together for the benefit of its African counterpart the messages about priorities for CARICOM businesses in its trade and economic relations with third parties, and in particular outlooks for engagement with Africa and vice versa. So I think that it was valuable for the business groups to first be talking to each other, and to having spoken to each other, to move it to another level in terms of entering into an understanding with each other on future cooperation.
Ambassador Komishong is hopeful and optimistic about this partnership and all of its possibilities for both regions.
As I said, we simply have to make sure that all of these undertakings are materialized. So, for example, the direct flight must become a reality. And in fact, when the direct flight becomes a reality, that is going to give, that is going to produce a great vote of confidence in the entire relationship, because the Caribbean and African people have been clamoring for such a direct connection between the two regions. This is something that we've talked about for decades. And once we have promised it at the forum, once we can fulfill that promise within a matter of months, that will boost everybody's confidence in this initiative. We are fortunate that in the African Export-Import Bank, we have a very substantial partner. Caribbean people need to be aware that this is a major banking institution. By Caribbean standards, this is a giant, this is a giant institution. This is a multi-billion-dollar bank. It is headquartered in Egypt, but it has branches all across the different regions of Africa. It was established in 1993 by the African governments. It's something, it has a corporate structure akin to, say, the Caribbean Development Bank. And a very, very powerful institution. And this is going to make the difference between, simple talk and actual concrete action. Because the bank has said that it is going to put its money where its mouth is. That in the first instance, it is going to allocate $700 million to financing these trade and investment relations between Africa and the Caribbean. 700 million US, that is 1.4 billion Barbados dollars. That is significant capital investment. That is significant allocation of credit to finance trade between the two regions. So I think, and the fact that we now have the Africa Caribbean Business Council, where private sector business interests from both regions have their own institution that brings them together. This is going to facilitate them talking to each other and making private sector business agreements with each other. I think we have done a brilliant job at this forum in outlining a blueprint, outlining a very specific, concrete program to take us forward. So it is up to us now. The program is there. We have done brilliantly. We have outlined it. We all know what it is. It is now simply to be hands-on, not to go to sleep on it, not to lapse, and to make sure that we accomplish all of the things that we said that we were going to accomplish, and that in 2023, all of the forces that gathered in Barbados, that we come together once again somewhere on the African continent to do a review, of the year's work, and to make additional plans for the second phase of going forward. So it's up to us. It is in our hands. The path ahead is clear. It is up to us to act on it and to make sure we fulfill all of the things that we said that we are going to do.
Well, something special is being built for all of us. May we do our part to ensure that this partnership, which is set to unite the people of the Caribbean with the people of Africa, becomes a reality. Until next time, I'm Miles Eversley. Do take care and thanks for your time.